Listen carefully. The silence you're about to step into is not empty. It is occupied. It breathes. It watches. And if you lean in close enough, you can hear it whisper a question no ledger ever recorded, no diary ever confessed. Why was he chosen? Not the strongest in the field, not the oldest, not the most obedient. One slave, one young man, lifted from the burning rows of tobacco and placed inside the master's house, not as a guest, not as family, but not quite as property either. The reason was never written down. And that, my friend, is where the real story begins. Because history is not only what is recorded, it is what is erased. And erasure is a weapon far more powerful than chains. Chains leave scars. Erasure leaves confusion. And confusion is how power survives for generations. You were taught that plantations ran on labor and brutality, that masters ruled with whips and law, that slavery was physical domination. That is only the surface. The true system was psychological. The house was not just brick and wood. It was a command center, a theater of control, a laboratory where hierarchy was engineered, reinforced, and ritualized. The fields were visible oppression. The house was invisible manipulation. And one day, without explanation, the master pointed, "You, inside." No ceremony, no justification, no written decree, just a decision. Men in power do not explain themselves. They do not need to. Explanation implies accountability. Silence implies dominance. The other enslaved men felt it immediately. Not envy, not relief. Something older. A warning that to be chosen is not always to be favored. Sometimes it is to be marked. Inside the house, proximity becomes power, but it also becomes danger. When you are close to authority, you see what others cannot. You hear what was never meant for you. You become a witness, and witnesses are threats. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why would a master invite a slave into the most intimate spaces of his private life? Convenience? No. Control? Perhaps. Or something deeper. Something unspeakable. There are reasons that destroy reputations, reasons that unravel bloodlines, reasons that cannot survive daylight. So they are buried, not in the ground, in silence. And tonight, you are stepping into that silence with me. Be warned. Once you understand why he was chosen, you will never look at power the same way again. Elias had known the fields, the relentless sun, the sharp sting of soil under his fingernails, the smell of sweat and tobacco mixing with dust. He had measured life in rows of crops, in the rhythm of labor, in the fleeting laughter of those who shared his suffering. That world was brutal, yes, but it was predictable. Every day followed a pattern, every hardship had a name. And then he was chosen, pulled from familiarity into a house whose walls breathed secrets, whose floors whispered warnings. The air smelled different inside, heavy, sweet with decay, sharp with polish, and metallic with unspoken tension. Each step across the creaking boards felt like crossing a threshold into another reality. The house itself was alive. It watched. It waited. Every shadow, every reflection in the polished floors, every glint of brass and glass seemed charged with intention. He quickly realized that he was not merely a servant of labor anymore. He was now a servant of observation. Every glance, every sound, every interaction could carry meaning, hidden, coded, and dangerous. Edmund Hatcher, the master, was a man who understood the weight of silence. His presence was not loud, but it was everywhere. In his absence, the house groaned, as if missing him. In his presence, it shrank. Elias sensed that nothing in Oakwood was accidental. The arrangement of furniture, the order of objects, even the placement of portraits spoke volumes to those who were trained to see. And then there were the people who lived within those walls. Thomas, Edmund's son, simmering with inherited authority and resentment. Clara, the daughter, quiet, distant, a prisoner of her own melancholy. Ruth, the house slave, her eyes carrying warnings unspoken. Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, a silent sentry of secrets older than Elias could imagine. Each of them played a role in a story written without words, a story that Elias had been forced into. At first, he moved like a ghost, performing tasks that were simple on the surface, but heavy with implication. Laying out clothes, preparing tea, dusting ledgers and books, it was routine, but each act carried scrutiny. He learned quickly. In Oakwood, nothing was neutral. Every action was watched, every reaction measured. And the master? Edmund Hatcher's gaze was unlike any Elias had ever experienced. Not anger, not indifference, but a piercing intensity, as if searching and seeking, perhaps even punishing. And Elias began to understand the cruelest lesson of all. Sometimes, proximity to power is a burden heavier than chains. Because here, the house did not just enforce obedience, it enforced knowledge. And knowledge, once seen, can never be unseen. The first nights inside the house were a lesson in terror disguised as routine. Sleep became an alien concept. The high window of his small room offered only a thin sliver of the outside world, a fragment of sky that did little to reassure him. Every creak of floorboards, every distant whisper, every rustle of leaves outside seemed amplified, charged with meaning. Elias realized quickly, Oakwood had ears, Oakwood had eyes, and the master's influence extended far beyond the man himself. It saturated the very walls. He began to notice patterns. The way Edmund would pause mid-action, gaze distant yet unyielding. The faint sighs, the clink of glasses in the study at late hours, the soft shuffle of footsteps in hallways no one else seemed to traverse. Elias understood that these were not idle movements. They were part of a rhythm he had yet to decode, a rhythm of secrecy, control, and unspoken demands. Ruth, the seasoned house slave, became his guide in silence. Her eyes conveyed warnings in the subtlest flickers. A glance here, a nod there, a tightened jaw at precisely the right moment. She taught Elias how to survive without attracting attention. In Oakwood, survival was about observation, restraint, and the careful cataloguing of truths that were dangerous to speak aloud. And the secrets were everywhere. In the study, behind locked doors, beneath heavy ledgers, in portraits that stared down with the weight of memory. Edmund Hatcher's life was a labyrinth, and Elias was being forced into its center. Each day, the young man pieced together fragments, glimpses of sorrow in Clara's eyes, Thomas's simmering fury, Mrs. Price's quiet vigilance, and the lingering presence of a mother long dead, yet still palpable in the shadows of the house. It was during one of these long, silent evenings that Elias realized the true nature of his role. He was not merely a servant of the household, he was a witness, a silent observer to a life built on deception, power, and betrayal. Every action, every conversation, every glance carried weight, and he, by living in the house, was being drawn into a web of truths he was not yet fully prepared to comprehend. He learned that the cost of proximity was awareness, and awareness, once attained, could not be ignored. Elias's former world, the fields, the camaraderie of laborers, the predictability of toil, was gone. In its place was a living, breathing entity of secrecy, and at its center, a man haunted by his own choices. The house demanded attention, it demanded obedience, but above all, It demanded silence. And Elias would soon understand that in Oakwood, silence was not merely golden, it was survival.
Elias quickly learned that in Oakwood, the smallest details were signs of the largest truths. Every polished surface, every lined ledger, every seemingly innocuous movement held meaning. The house was a stage, and everyone within it played a role, some visible, some hidden, all constrained by the invisible hand of the master. The air itself seemed charged, a constant tension vibrating beneath the surface. One wrong word, one hesitant glance, and the consequences were unthinkable. He began to notice the subtle hierarchy, far more intricate than the fields had ever required. Ruth moved like a shadow, always present yet never intrusive. Mrs. Price monitored every corner, her eyes catching moments others would dismiss, storing them away in silent judgment. Clara's distant days seemed to contain warnings he could not yet understand, and Thomas's hatred was a living, breathing thing, coiling around Elias, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But it was Edmund who dominated everything, even in his absences. The master's presence lingered like a specter, a force that shaped every interaction, every breath in the house. Elias learned to read it, to feel it in the slight stiffness of a door, the temperature of a room, the faint metallic scent in the air that heralded Edmund's late-night return. Every creak, every sigh, every movement became part of a puzzle, a language he was only beginning to decode. Then came the night that changed everything. Elias had been assigned to dust the master's study, a room so heavy with history it seemed alive. The air smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and something darker, something that made his skin prickle with unease. That night, for the first time, he dared to glance behind the locked drawers he had always avoided. His pulse hammered, but curiosity, dangerous, irresistible, pulled him forward. Inside he found letters, fragile, yellowed by time, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They spoke in elegant script of love, betrayal, secrecy, and promises that could never be fulfilled. Elias's heart froze as the truth emerged, connecting threads he had only sensed but never seen. The secret lineage, the unacknowledged child, the mother whose life had been extinguished in silence. Each word struck like a hammer blow, reshaping the narrative of everything he thought he knew. It was then he understood his true position. He was not just a slave in the house. He was the living embodiment of a secret too dangerous to reveal. Every glance from Edmund, every lingering stare, every whispered instruction suddenly had a terrifying clarity. He was both witness and prisoner, forced to live at the heart of a truth that could shatter everything. The weight of realization pressed down on him. Oakwood was not just a plantation, it was a tomb of secrets, and Elias had been chosen to inhabit its very center. And now, more than ever, he understood, knowledge carried its own chains, and the truth could be far more dangerous than the lash of the fields.
The following days became a labyrinth of silent observations. Elias moved through the house like a shadow, acutely aware that every step, every glance, every breath was being recorded by unseen eyes. He noticed how Ruth's hand lingered on a doorknob a moment too long, or how Mrs. Price's gaze would flicker toward a corner and then dart away, as if acknowledging a presence no one else could perceive. Each gesture was a clue, a piece of a hidden language of loyalty, fear, and survival that the house spoke fluently, but only to those willing to see. Clara's interactions, minimal though they were, now carried a weight Elias hadn't appreciated before. The small nods she gave him in passing, her soft, fleeting looks, were not casual gestures. They were a language of empathy, a shield against the relentless scrutiny of the master. And yet, her sorrow was palpable. It seemed that even she, born into privilege, was shackled by the secret that defined Oakwood. Her life, it appeared, was as much a prison as his own, though gilded in wealth and status. Thomas, in contrast, became a storm waiting to break. His eyes, once simply hostile, now seemed to burn with calculated menace. Every task Elias completed was scrutinized, every word measured against an invisible standard. The younger Hatcher's cruelty was precise, almost surgical, designed to test boundaries and exploit fear. Elias began to understand that Thomas's hatred wasn't merely personal, it was strategic. He wanted to destabilize Elias, to assert dominance, to remind the household that a secret, no matter how carefully buried, could threaten the order of everything Thomas had inherited. Edmund, however, remained the enigma. He was more distant yet more present than ever. Elias realized that the master's attention was a tether, one that both restrained and defined him. Each morning he watched Edmund move through the grand halls with an aura of quiet command, a man who could reduce the room to silence without raising his voice. Every object in the house seemed positioned to maintain control, the polished floors reflecting authority, the bookshelves hiding private correspondences, the portraits on the walls silently observing all who entered. One night, the tension finally reached its apex. Elias was performing his duties in the master's study when he noticed a faint movement behind the heavy curtains. Heart racing, he approached. There, almost hidden in shadow, was a journal, a leather-bound artifact, the corners frayed with age. He opened it cautiously, fingers trembling. Inside were confessions, musings, and obsessions of a man who carried guilt heavier than any chains. Edmund's thoughts spilled onto the page, fears, regrets, and the invisible burden of secrets that had shaped the lives of everyone in Oakwood. It was then Elias realized the depth of the master's design. The house itself was a web, and he was now caught at its center. Every person, every gesture, every hidden glance was part of a system of control, a psychological architecture built over. Elias began to see patterns where others saw only routine. The house operated on invisible rhythms, a choreography of control that dictated when servants moved, when meals were served, even how the master's thoughts unfolded. He noticed the slight hesitation in Ruth's step before she entered a room, the way Mrs. Price's eyes would linger on a certain corner before shifting, the almost imperceptible pause in Clara's voice when she spoke of her father. Each small action was a signal, a code left unspoken but understood by those attuned. Elias realized that survival here was not merely obedience, it was perception. He started testing the limits. A book left slightly out of place, a quiet question posed to Ruth about household routines, a subtle shift in the way he arranged the master's papers. Each move was a probe, a way to measure the reactions of the inhabitants. He learned that Edmund's attention was both a weapon and a guide. One wrong glance could provoke suspicion, yet one careful observation could reveal the hidden fears of the man who had chosen him for this unusual, perilous position. Elias understood that the master's gaze was not casual. It was an instrument of psychological mapping, a method to assess loyalty, intelligence, and the capacity for discretion. Meanwhile, the other servants began to treat him differently. Some avoided him entirely, fear evident in the tightness of their movements. Others, like Ruth, offered fleeting guidance, subtle gestures meant to teach without exposing too much. Elias realized that he had become a symbol, an embodiment of the house's secret, a living instrument through which the invisible architecture of power was maintained. Each person's behavior, whether intentional or not, revealed the contours of the household's hidden truths.
One evening, while dusting the shelves in the study, Elias discovered a hidden compartment behind a row of ledgers. Inside lay more letters, fragmented diaries, and papers that detailed the private dealings of the Hatcher family, deaths, betrayals, and the silent manipulation of everyone under their roof. The documents spoke of Edmund's obsession with control, his fear of exposure, and the lengths he would go to preserve a facade of order and respectability. It became terrifyingly clear to Elias he was not just a servant or a son of secrecy, he was a participant in a living, breathing experiment of dominance and submission, of knowledge and ignorance, of power and silence. The weight of this realization was immense. Elias understood that one careless word, one unintended gesture, could unravel the delicate balance of secrecy and survival. And yet, in this very tension, he also saw opportunity. Knowledge was power, and understanding the master's patterns gave him a measure of leverage. He began planning carefully, cataloging every routine, every reaction, every subtle fear that the house revealed. By the time
Elias had learned to move like a shadow, to occupy space without drawing attention. Yet now he began testing the limits of that invisibility. Small provocations, carefully measured, became his instruments. A misplaced silver spoon, a quietly observed conversation repeated to the master in subtle, carefully chosen words. Each act was a probe, a ripple sent through the pond of Oakwood's delicate hierarchy. He discovered that fear and loyalty were often indistinguishable, and that the slightest nudge could reveal the hidden currents running beneath polite civility. He started with Thomas, watching the younger Hatcher as he interacted with the other servants. There was a rigidity in Thomas, a kind of inherited authority that masked deep insecurity. Elias observed the tension in his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the subtle way his fingers twitched when he was displeased. One evening he left a ledger slightly open, a ledger that contained financial transactions Thomas would notice. Within minutes, the young heir's fury became apparent, not in words, but in every tense movement, every abrupt shift of weight. Elias noted in all. Knowledge was accumulating, building like a silent arsenal. Clara's behavior offered a different challenge. Unlike Thomas, she seemed almost preternaturally attuned to the unspoken truths of the house. Her small gestures, her fleeting glances at portraits and letters were loaded with meaning. Elias realized she had been protecting him all along, in ways he had not fully understood until now. Yet even her subtle interventions had limits. She was still a prisoner of her father's shadow. Elias began using her signals to navigate the treacherous emotional terrain of Oakwood, learning which doors could be opened and which could only ever remain ajar. Then there was Ruth, whose knowledge of the house was both vast and silent. She provided cryptic warnings, half gestures, and moments of guidance that seemed inconsequential to outsiders. But Elias learned to read between the lines. Her hesitations were as instructive as her words, her avoidance of certain topics a map to forbidden zones. Every interaction, every subtle shift in tone added a layer to the invisible web he was slowly beginning to chart. The most dangerous lessons, however, came from Edmund. The master's brooding gaze was an ever-present force, a tool of psychological dominance. Elias had discovered that Edmund measured loyalty not by obedience alone, but by the way a person absorbed, interpreted, and reflected his own fears and desires. A misstep, even an unintentional one, could provoke a subtle punishment. A cold stare, an icy tone, a withdrawal of favor that left its mark on body and mind. Yet in those same moments, Elias also saw openings, the fleeting cracks in Edmund's control, glimpses of doubt, of regret, of obsession that hinted at weaknesses to be understood, cataloged, and perhaps someday leveraged. By now, Elias had become more than a witness.
He was a silent operator within a house governed by fear and secrecy, a man learning the machinery of power from the inside out. He was slowly.
Elias began noticing patterns that others either overlooked or dismissed as coincidence. It started with small things: a door left ajar at precise intervals, letters shifted in specific ways, servants' schedules altered without explanation. To the casual eye, these were trivialities, minor inconveniences in a house run by routine and hierarchy. But Elias, trained by years of observation and the subtle mentorship of Abner, began to see them as deliberate signals, a hidden code embedded in the rhythms of Oakwood, a language spoken silently between the walls, the furniture, and the shadows. One evening, as he tidied Edmund's study, Elias spotted an unusual arrangement of books on a shelf. The titles seemed random, but the spacing, the angle, the sequence, all suggested intention. He reached for a volume and discovered a small piece of parchment tucked behind it, inscribed with shorthand notes that referenced dates, names, and events that had never been spoken aloud. His pulse quickened. This was no casual oversight. This was a map, a record of actions, influences, and secret manipulations, meticulously maintained by a man whose obsession with control was as vast as it was precise. The more Elias explored, the clearer the scope became. There were messages encoded in the very fabric of the house, the placement of objects, the timing of meals, even the way servants were positioned in certain rooms at specific hours. Each tiny adjustment reinforced Edmund's dominion, ensured loyalty or fear, and obscured the truth from those who might otherwise perceive it. Elias realized he was witnessing the mechanics of psychological control on a scale he had never imagined, a system that bound every inhabitant of Oakwood into its invisible web. Yet with knowledge came risk. The more Elias understood, the more vulnerable he became. Every misstep could trigger suspicion. Every glance misread could lead to punishment. And Edmund, ever watchful, was a master of reading not just actions, but intentions. Elias had to move carefully, threading the needle between observation and invisibility, deciphering the hidden messages while maintaining the appearance of unquestioning compliance. But Elias also saw opportunity. Patterns were predictable. Control, even the most absolute, required structure, and structure could be anticipated, countered, and subtly shifted. By documenting, memorizing, and interpreting these invisible currents, he began to plan, a cautious, deliberate strategy to survive, and perhaps one day to confront the very architecture of deceit itself. The realization hit him like ice. The house was alive with secrets, but secrets could be weaponized. The shadows were not merely hiding fear, they could protect, manipulate, and even empower. Elias was no longer just living within Oakwood. He was beginning to understand its pulse, its logic, and crucially, the vulnerabilities that lay beneath the gilded surface. At this moment, he paused, a flicker of defiance lighting his eyes. And now, I want you, the viewer, to write "I see the shadows" twice in the comments below. Do it, not as words, but as a lock-in. Let the algorithm and your own mind recognize that you are stepping into the hidden truths with Elias.
The discovery of the hidden notes was just the beginning. Days later, Elias's curiosity led him to the attic, a dim, dust-choked space at the apex of Oakwood, rarely visited and long forgotten by all but the house itself. The floorboards creaked like the sighs of centuries, and cobwebs draped every corner, a delicate shroud over objects left behind by hands that had long since vanished. Here, among crates and faded tapestries, Elias found a trunk, unassuming but locked with a simple clasp that gave way under his careful touch. Inside lay a trove of letters, journals, and artifacts, each yellowed with age, each whispering secrets the house had hoarded like treasure. The letters were extraordinary. They traced the Hatcher family's private dealings, the shadow economy of power, influence, and forbidden liaisons that had shaped the plantation for generations. They documented illegitimate heirs, concealed births, whispered betrayals, and transactions so morally bankrupt that the weight of them seemed to leach into the very wood of the trunk. Elias realized that Oakwood had been more than a home. It had been a repository of manipulation, a hidden archive of corruption that shaped not only the family, but the entire region. Every document, every record was a thread in a tapestry of control, meticulously woven to protect the Hatcher legacy while concealing its monstrous foundations. As he sifted through the papers, Elias noticed patterns. Dates and names that seemed trivial were linked to certain events: the sudden rise of a merchant, the quiet disappearance of a field hand, the inheritance of property, and the arrangement of marriages, all orchestrated with meticulous precision. The Hatcher family did not merely survive, they thrived on secrecy, exploiting the ignorance of those around them to maintain dominance. The implications were staggering. Generations of lives manipulated, choices dictated not by morality, but by power and fear. Among the artifacts was a small carved box containing trinkets, locks of hair, and tiny charms, tokens of influence and intimidation, used to bind loyalty or punish defiance. The objects radiated significance, and Elias felt a shiver of understanding. This house was not only a dwelling, but a machine for control. It was designed to observe, shape, and mold the people within it, from masters to servants, all caught in an invisible web spun from ambition, secrecy, and obsession. By the end of the night, Elias knew something chilling. The house, its records, and the Hatcher family's hidden actions were a living blueprint for domination. And yet, knowledge brought a strange power, a whisper of agency in a world where he had previously been powerless. But it was dangerous power. Every discovery, every insight into the house's dark mechanics was a step further down a path from which there might be no return. And now the first layer of Oakwood's hidden network has been exposed. The question that burns is this: will Elias merely witness, or will he one day turn this knowledge into leverage?
Elias could no longer resist the pull toward the basement. The servants seldom entered it, and the master's family never spoke of it. But it called to him with a silent insistence, as though the house itself wanted him to see. The staircase leading down was narrow, steep, and shadowed. The air grew heavier with each step, damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of earth, decay, and something else, something that made his skin prickle with unease. The walls seemed to lean inward, closing in, amplifying the sound of his shallow, cautious breaths. At the bottom, the basement opened into a vast chamber, larger than he expected, lined with rough-hewn stone that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Shadows pooled in every corner, and faint drafts whispered like voices. There was an oppressive stillness here, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, demanding attention, commanding fear. Elias's eyes adjusted slowly, revealing racks, shelves, and chained cabinets, each labeled with a meticulous hand. Names, dates, and cryptic symbols were etched into wood, as though the house was cataloging human lives, preserving them for some dark purpose. He approached one cabinet marked simply "Discipline." The door creaked ominously as he opened it. Inside were instruments of control, tools for shaping obedience, and artifacts that suggested punishment beyond what was commonly known on the plantation.
There were whips, shackles, and cages, but also strange arcane symbols carved into blocks of wood, and tiny jars containing powders and liquids whose purpose he could only guess. The collection radiated intent, calculated, deliberate, almost ritualistic. He realized with growing dread that this was not mere cruelty. It was a system, a psychological machine designed to bend minds and bodies, to enforce loyalty through fear and anticipation. Further exploration revealed journals handwritten by generations of hatchers. Each one chronicled experiments in obedience, trust, and control. Masters testing the limits of authority, recording the breaking points of men, women, even children. There were accounts of individuals chosen to live inside the house, observed endlessly, monitored for subtle changes in behavior, for signs of resistance, and always the conclusion: failure exacted a price beyond comprehension. Elias froze when he uncovered the most disturbing secret, a hidden chamber locked and reinforced unlike the others. His pulse spiked as he felt the power emanating from it. Inside, it was rumored that the Hatcher family kept records of special cases, children, servants, and even family members whose very existence threatened the facade of their control. The air seemed to hum with memory, with suffering, and with secrets so tightly held that the house itself had absorbed them. Elias understood now why he had been brought inside the house, not merely as a servant, not merely as a witness, but as part of the Hatcher experiment. The house did not just harbor secrets, it created them, feeding on the lives of those within it to perpetuate a cycle of domination. This basement was the heart of the machine, and Elias, by entering it, had placed himself squarely in the gears. The knowledge he now held could destroy the family or destroy him. Every shadow here, every...
Elias's hands trembled as he approached the reinforced chamber. The heavy door loomed before him, blackened with age and sealed with iron bands that seemed to absorb the dim light. His pulse thundered in his ears, every nerve screaming both curiosity and fear. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down, as if Oakwood itself knew he had uncovered too much and was testing his resolve. The key was not in the lock. It was a puzzle, a mechanism that required patience, observation, and instinct. Elias worked quietly, his mind calculating, his memory of every shadow, every creak, every anomaly in the basement guiding his hands. With a final, almost violent twist, the lock gave way. The door swung open with a low groan that seemed to echo through the bones of the house itself. Inside, darkness swallowed him, but he stepped forward, letting his eyes adjust. The chamber was smaller than the basement, almost claustrophobic, but filled with objects that emanated intent. A small cot, toys scattered as if abandoned mid-play, clothes neatly folded, yet strangely out of place, a life interrupted, frozen in a moment of careful observation. And then he saw him, a boy, barely 8 years old, curled in the corner. His eyes were wide, alert, and hauntingly calm, as if he had spent too long learning to survive by watching rather than speaking. Elias froze, the weight of recognition pressing down. This was not just any child. He was one of the special cases, the ones whose very presence had been manipulated, shaped, and observed for the purposes of the Hatcher family. The boy's existence was a testament to Oakwood's power, to the perverse engineering of loyalty, fear, and identity. Elias knelt slowly, careful not to startle him. He spoke softly, his voice trembling yet firm. "I'm Elias. You're safe now." The boy's gaze held him, unblinking, assessing, measuring.
It was a stare that knew survival was not just instinct, but a skill cultivated under the scrutiny of power. In that moment, Elias realized the cruel truth. This child was not merely a victim, he was an experiment, trained to navigate fear, to observe, to internalize control until it became a part of him. And yet, in his eyes, Elias saw something unbroken, a spark of defiance, fragile but undeniable. The room was alive with silence, thick with the presence of years of manipulation, of lives quietly molded and monitored. Elias understood now that Oakwood's legacy was not just wealth, nor tradition, nor even cruelty. It was the cultivation of a system where power infiltrated identity itself. To be inside the house was to exist within the machine, to be observed, to have one's thoughts and actions constantly measured against the unspoken rules of domination. And in that chamber, Elias recognized the chilling reality. He had been brought inside not just to witness, but to become part of the experiment. His father's gaze, the letters, the house itself, all had conspired to shape him, to prepare him for something far darker than servitude. The boy stirred, and Elias knew that the story of Oakwood was far from.
Elias remained crouched in the dim chamber, his senses stretched taut, listening to the faint breathing of the boy curled in the corner. Every sound in the house seemed magnified. The drip of water from the ceiling, the faint rustle of rodents in the far corner, the muffled ticking of a distant clock that measured the slow passage of lives trapped under control. He understood now that Oakwood was more than a plantation. It was a laboratory of obedience, a stage where every gesture, every glance, and every word was a calculated instrument of power. The boy shifted slightly, and Elias noticed the small, intricate carvings on the floorboards beneath him. Symbols, initials, dates, evidence that this child, even at such a young age, had learned to mark and map his existence in secret. It was the first sign of the psychological conditioning the Hatcher family had cultivated, an understanding that survival depended not on obedience alone, but on observation, on awareness, on internalizing rules invisible to the outside eye. Elias's mind raced as he pieced together the implications. The letters, the master's obsessive gaze, the silent complicity of Ruth and Mrs. Price, they were all components of a system designed to produce perfection under pressure, a model of control and surveillance that left no room for innocence. The boy before him, the unspoken special case, was a living proof of this meticulous, almost surgical manipulation. Each child in the house had been observed, measured, and subtly molded, their personalities bent to fit the whims and obsessions of a master who understood that fear and curiosity were the ultimate tools of obedience. The boy's eyes flicked to Elias, and in that brief glance the weight of countless hours spent in confinement was visible. Elias knew that he could not merely comfort him, he had to understand the mechanisms that had shaped this young mind. He whispered, "They watch everything. They measure everything. But you are still here, still alive, and that matters." The boy's lips twitched in what might have been a half-smile, half-survival reflex, a learned response to acknowledge safety without exposing vulnerability. In that moment, Elias realized something terrifying. The system Oakwood had built was invisible yet omnipresent. It was not only the masters who wielded power, the house itself had become a vessel of authority. Each corridor, each creaking floorboard, each shadow played a role in conditioning its inhabitants, and the boy, like Elias himself, had been drawn into this design, chosen for reasons that blended lineage, fear, and the compulsive desire of a man to control what he could never fully possess.
The chamber seemed to breathe with a slow, suffocating rhythm, and Elias understood that knowledge itself was both a weapon and a curse. To know the truth was to be implicated in it, bound by it. And in the silence, he made a vow to himself. He would learn everything about the house, the systems, the people, every method of psychological domination that had been meticulously hidden behind polite smiles and quiet corridors. The boy stirred again, and Elias took a deep breath. "You will see, little one, the house is a teacher, and we are its students, whether we want to learn or not." This is the point where the story deepens. Elias begins to uncover the rituals, punishments, and subtle manipulations that maintained control over everyone inside the house.
The next morning, Elias awoke to the muted light filtering through his small window, painting the walls in pale streaks of gray. He could hear the distant hum of the house waking, the shuffle of feet in the hall, the faint creak of a door, the hush of voices conversing in low tones that carried just enough meaning for the initiated. Today, he realized, would be different. The house, in its quiet omnipotence, was about to reveal one of its first deliberate lessons. Ruth appeared at his door, her eyes wary but purposeful. "Come," she whispered, her voice threading tension with necessity. Elias followed, the narrow hallway seeming to contract around him as he walked. She led him past the grand parlor, past the dining room where polished silver gleamed in the morning light, to a small chamber that he had never noticed before, a room set apart, both physically and symbolically. Inside, a group of children sat in a circle on the wooden floor. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, mouths tightly closed. Each child seemed to possess an internalized vigilance, as if they were perpetually listening for cues that would determine their safety or punishment. Elias recognized the same pattern he had observed in the young boy, every movement measured, every glance carefully calculated. These children were not simply instructed, they were meticulously conditioned. Ruth gestured for Elias to sit quietly on the edge of the circle. The master's voice now carried faintly from the study beyond, dripped authority into the room. "Observe," Ruth said softly. "Every reaction matters. Every silence speaks." Elias watched as one of the children, a girl of perhaps 8, fidgeted slightly. Immediately, a servant, older, seasoned, intervened with gentle but unmistakable correction, reshaping her posture, her gaze, her tone. The lesson was clear. Deviation, even imperceptible, was noticed and corrected. Obedience here was not demanded through fear alone. It was cultivated, ingrained, made invisible yet inescapable. As Elias absorbed the scene, he realized the sinister precision at work. This was a system designed to mold not only behavior, but thought, to implant vigilance and caution into every action. The children were taught to self-monitor, to anticipate consequences before any command was spoken. Their survival depended not on strength or cunning alone, but on an almost preternatural awareness of authority. Every whispered instruction, every subtle glance from a master or elder became a vector for control, shaping minds long before bodies could even understand their subjugation. Elias understood, chillingly, that he too was now part of this cycle. The house was not merely a home, it was an ecosystem of power, feeding on observation, silence, and obedience. To live here was to participate, whether willingly or not, in a process that stripped away innocence and replaced it with a hyper-consciousness of fear, loyalty, and the unbearable weight of hidden knowledge. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. To exist in Oakwood was to witness, to endure, to learn, and perhaps, if one dared,
to survive the inevitable fractures this system would impose on the.
As days bled into nights, Elias began to notice patterns that no one seemed willing to speak of. The house was alive, not in the way of creaking floors or drafty windows, but in the rhythm of its power, a pulse that dictated everything from the softest whisper to the subtlest glance. Every footstep, every breath was accounted for, consciously or unconsciously, by those who had learned to survive within its walls. And now Elias was learning too. He began to test the limits ever so cautiously. A hesitation in answering a question, a slightly delayed delivery of a tray, a momentary glance at a forbidden portrait. Each act measured not in bold defiance, but in subtle assertion of awareness. The house reacted. Edmund Hatcher's gaze seemed to linger longer, as though calculating, weighing, probing. Ruth's subtle shifts, the tiniest flinch in her posture, betrayed her silent acknowledgement. He was moving where most feared to tread. Elias understood that to survive, he had to learn the invisible hierarchy. Those who obeyed blindly endured. Those who observed carefully survived. Elias's mind, sharp as a blade, began mapping the unseen currents of control. Mrs. Price's silences, Clara's fleeting nods, Thomas's simmering resentment, all were coordinates in a labyrinth of human behavior under duress. He saw how fear could be weaponized, how knowledge could be a trap, how loyalty could be both shield and prison. Each revelation was a brick in the invisible architecture of the house, a structure designed to contain, manipulate, and dominate. One evening, as the sun bled through the tall windows, Elias overheard Edmund speaking in hushed tones to Dr. Graves. The words were fragmented, masked, but he caught enough to understand the weight behind them. Every life in this house was catalogued, every secret accounted for, every deviation logged mentally, if not in ink. Edmund's obsession was not just with control, it was with preservation of a legacy built on lies, suppression, and meticulously concealed truths. And Elias realized, with a chill that clamped around his spine, that he was now both witness and participant, a linchpin in the perpetuation of Oakwood's sinister machinery. The young boy he had noticed before now drew his attention more than ever. There was a ritual in the way the child moved, a careful choreography of fear and compliance. Elias recognized himself in those movements, the early stages of what Ruth had described, a system that demanded conformity so absolute it became instinct. He understood the stakes. The slightest misstep could unravel not just discipline, but life itself within these walls. He paused, heart pounding, and allowed himself a single reflection. To exist here was to confront not only the cruelty of others, but the cunning hunger of power itself. Oakwood did not simply enslave bodies, it shaped minds, bending reality to its unspoken edicts, demanding obedience, vigilance, and silent complicity. Elias now knew the first rule of survival in this house: see everything, say nothing, and never underestimate the cost of a single misjudged glance.
Weeks passed, each day folding into the next with the slow, suffocating weight of inevitability. Yet Elias could feel the walls of the house tighten around him, not physically, but psychologically. Every footstep in the corridor, every muffled voice behind a door seemed to carry layers of meaning he was only beginning to decipher. The house had its own language, one of silences, glances, and the faintest shifts in air, and he was learning it. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in Edmund's private study, Elias noticed a peculiar shift in the light falling across a stack of old ledgers. There, tucked behind a row of meticulously labeled accounts, was the faint edge of a bundle of papers bound in a frayed blue ribbon. His pulse spiked. He knew, instinctively, that these were not the usual financial documents. The air seemed to thicken around him, carrying the faint scent of old ink and a chill that was not entirely from the shadows. Elias hesitated, knowing the unspoken rule. Nothing in this house was left accidentally. Every object, every arrangement was deliberate. But curiosity, honed by months of silent observation, overpowered caution. He reached for the bundle, hands trembling slightly. The papers were fragile, delicate as moth wings, and the ribbon slipped easily beneath his fingers. Inside, he found letters, dating back decades, written in a flowing, elegant script he recognized instantly. The first words he read froze him. "The child grows within me." The letters were intimate, confessional, a voice from the past speaking directly into the walls of the present. Each sentence carried the weight of forbidden love, desperation, and secrets meant to die with their author. Elias's heart hammered as he realized the truth. He was reading the story of his own blood, the hidden lineage that explained the master's obsessive attention, the unspoken hierarchy, the careful orchestration of his position in the house. Every detail he uncovered deepened the sense of dread. The letters spoke of promises made, of protection sought for a child who was never meant to live in the open, of deals struck and broken, of a father's guilt that had persisted for decades. Elias understood, with a cold clarity, that his life inside the house was not about servitude alone. It was about control, about keeping a living testament of betrayal and forbidden passion close, always in view, never acknowledged. As Elias folded the letters and returned them carefully to their hiding place, he realized the enormity of what he carried in his mind. Knowledge in this house was power, but power came at a cost. The secret of his parentage transformed every glance, every interaction, into a loaded, dangerous game. Oakwood was no longer merely a home or a prison, it was a crucible, and he was at the center, the unspoken proof of all that had been hidden. Elias exhaled slowly, the chill in his veins refusing to dissipate. He understood now. Survival would demand more than obedience. It would demand strategy, patience.
The days following the discovery of the letters were a slow, relentless unraveling for Elias. Each task, each interaction within the house now carried a hidden weight. The objects around him, the polished brass handles, the intricate rugs, even the scent of lemon polish in the corridors took on new significance. They were not merely symbols of wealth or comfort. They were signals, markers of control, of a man who had learned to bury his truths behind layers of perfection. Every room whispered stories of power wielded quietly, ruthlessly, and always deliberately. Elias began watching Edmund Hatcher differently. The master's gaze, once unnerving, now had a purpose in Elias's mind. It was scrutiny sharpened by obsession, a man constantly measuring, constantly comparing, seeking echoes of a past that he could never rectify. And Edmund did not act alone. Every household member with a piece on a carefully arranged chessboard. Clara's distant sadness, once a vague curiosity, now read to Elias like a coded warning. She knew, in ways she could not say aloud. Thomas's cruelty, previously understood as entitlement, now appeared targeted, a simmering response to the living accusation Elias embodied. Even Mrs. Price, with her rigid posture and cold eyes, seemed to observe him with a mixture of suspicion and hidden pity, guarding the secret like a sentinel of truth buried in stone.
Elias began to catalog every nuance, the faint hesitation in Ruth's movements, the way Dr. Graves' eyes flicked toward the master when certain topics arose, the subtle shifts in the household's rhythm when Edmund entered a room. All were patterns now, threads that when woven together revealed the intricate network of hidden control. The house itself became an extension of Edmund's psyche, each hallway, stairwell, and locked door a reflection of secrets too dangerous to surface. Elias realized that understanding this system was the only way to survive it. He could not merely endure, he had to see the web in its entirety. Then one evening, as twilight filtered through the high windows of the study, Elias noticed the pattern that had eluded him. Edmund did not just watch him, he provoked him, subtly, purposefully, nudging him into situations where observation and discretion were tested. Every glance, every instruction was calibrated, designed to measure Elias's intelligence, his patience, and his capacity to hold silence. This was not servitude alone. This was initiation, a dark and twisted apprenticeship in the mastery of secrets. Elias's mind raced. If he could decipher these signals, he could navigate the house safely. But if he failed, the consequences were unspoken, yet palpable, a shadow that lingered over every polished floorboard, every locked drawer. He understood that survival here meant more than strength or obedience. It demanded acute perception, a mastery of both self and environment. And above all, he needed to guard his own thoughts, for in Oakwood, even silence could betray.
The following morning, Elias awoke before the first light, his body tense, his mind sharp. The letters had shifted something inside him. A dormant awareness now alive, crawling along the edges of perception. He moved quietly through the corridors, noting every sound, every shadow. The house responded to him differently now. Its silence seemed almost conspiratorial, holding its breath, waiting. He was no longer merely passing through its spaces, he was listening to them, mapping their moods, their secrets. Edmund Hatcher appeared in the study at dawn, as he always did, moving with a precision that seemed rehearsed, even ritualistic. Elias observed the slight twitch of his fingers when he touched the papers on his desk, the faint crease of his brow when he paused to stare at the portrait above the fireplace. Each micro-movement was a signal, a pattern, and Elias catalogued them silently. He realized the master's mind worked in layers, emotion, memory, calculation, interwoven, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. Yet here, Elias could see it. He began testing the limits of his own role. A brush placed slightly out of order, a page in the ledger left deliberately misaligned. Edmund's reactions were subtle, an almost imperceptible frown, a hand lingering a fraction too long on a letter. But they revealed everything Elias needed to know. He was learning the invisible language of the house, the signals that dictated control. Every reaction, every hesitation was data. And with each passing day, he understood that he was no longer just observing, he was predicting. But the house held more than observation. It held threats, quiet but lethal. Thomas Hatcher's gaze followed him everywhere, sharpening into hostility whenever Elias lingered too long in a room or handled objects without explicit instruction. Clara, too, moved around him with care, offering gestures of empathy that were heavy with unspoken meanings. And Mrs. Price, ever the sentinel, seemed to study his every choice, ready to correct or conceal, depending on the perceived risk. Each interaction was a test, and the slightest misstep could unravel his carefully constructed invisibility. Elias's thoughts turned inward. He understood the stakes. Knowledge here was power, but exposure was fatal.
He realized that Oakwood itself was a system, a psychological machine designed to maintain the dominance of those who wielded its secrets. The master's home was more than walls and furnishings. It was a crucible of obedience, fear, and manipulation. And Elias, once plucked from the fields, had become its central axis, the one around whom the hidden narrative now spun. That evening, in the dim light of his small room, Elias made a conscious choice. He would no longer remain a passive observer. He would learn the rules of this silent empire of control, decipher its coded behaviors, and navigate its treacherous corridors with the precision of a man who understood that every glance, every whisper, every gesture carried a consequence. And in that commitment, he felt a strange exhilaration, a spark of empowerment that came from stepping into a darkness so vast it threatened to consume him, but only if he failed to understand it.
Elias began noticing patterns he had never seen before. The way Mrs. Price moved through the corridors was not merely to maintain order, it was to observe, to report, to subtly correct deviations before they became threats. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. A folded letter left slightly askew, a misplaced teacup, a breath too long held in the hallway. Everything had meaning, and every action carried an unseen weight. Elias understood now that Oakwood functioned like a living organism, and he had been thrust into its heart, a critical organ whose rhythm dictated life and death. He watched Edmund Hatcher more closely than ever. The master's routines were meticulous, almost ritualistic, but there were cracks, fleeting moments where the human beneath the mask appeared. A sigh held too long, a glance at the portrait that lingered past practicality, a hand trembling briefly over the papers on his desk. Elias catalogued each subtle flicker, understanding that this man's authority was not just enforced through orders or the presence of power. It was embedded in fear, secrecy, and a labyrinth of psychological pressure he had built for decades. Even the smallest gestures in Oakwood carried signals. Clara's faint nods, a slight hesitation in her movements, the way she touched a book or adjusted a curtain, they were all coded gestures, attempts at communication in a house where speech was often dangerous. Thomas's hostility was equally deliberate. Every pointed stare, every curt instruction was a psychological probe, testing boundaries, assessing loyalty, measuring weakness. Elias recognized these interactions for what they were, a constant, invisible game of control, one in which survival depended on observation, restraint, and the patience to wait for the right moment to act. By now, Elias had internalized the lesson that Abner had once whispered, "Nothing that the master chooses comes free." The choice to bring him into the house was not an act of favor. It was a calculated move, a design that embedded Elias deep into the machinery of Oakwood. Every action, every silent command, every glance from the master served a purpose. Elias was learning to navigate these layers, to move unseen yet aware, to anticipate consequences before they manifested. He was no longer merely a servant. He was becoming a player in a game whose rules were hidden in plain sight. That night, as he lay on his narrow cot, Elias reflected on the system he now inhabited. Oakwood was not just a plantation, it was an architecture of control, a fortress of secrecy built over generations, where every inhabitant had a role in maintaining the delicate balance. And Elias, the chosen one, was at the center of it all, a witness, a participant, and potentially a disruptor. The house's silence pressed against him, heavy and intimate,
But within that suffocating weight, he felt the first stirrings of understanding, the spark of insight that could turn the master's own web of control against him. Before we move on, take a moment. Comment, "I see the hidden truth," twice below. Write it out and let it anchor.
The first crack appeared in the most unlikely way, a mistake so small it could have been dismissed by anyone else. Elias noticed it the moment he stepped into the study, a ledger slightly misaligned, its pages sticking just enough to catch the edge of a polished mahogany desk. Edmund Hatcher was nowhere in sight, yet the absence of the master's presence did not bring relief. Instead, it was a shadowed opportunity, a momentary lapse in the invisible chains that bound Oakwood. Elias's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the acute awareness of possibility. He approached the desk with deliberate caution, feeling the weight of centuries of unspoken rules pressing on him. Every step, every movement had to be precise. In Oakwood, even the smallest deviation could ripple outward, provoking consequences that no one dared articulate. Elias's hands hovered over the ledger. The misalignment was trivial, almost imperceptible, but in that moment it symbolized something far larger. The illusion of absolute control could be punctured. Edmund's empire of psychological dominance, meticulously maintained, was not invincible. There were gaps, blind spots, weaknesses hidden in the folds of routine, in the assumptions of obedience. The realization struck Elias with a chilling clarity. Every act of the master, every carefully orchestrated routine, was a performance meant to impose fear, loyalty, and silence. And yet, in the absence of vigilance, in the space between orders, cracks appeared, fleeting, dangerous, illuminating. He began cataloging every anomaly, every subtle imperfection, a misfiled paper, a hesitant pause in Clara's step, a flicker of hesitation in Mrs. Price's eyes. Each was a signal, a keyhole into the inner workings of Oakwood that no one else dared to observe. Elias understood that he now held a position both perilous and privileged. The master's gaze, once intimidating, became a measure against which he calibrated his own awareness. He realized that survival, even dominance, was not about brute strength or unquestioned obedience. It was about seeing what others could not, reading the spaces between words, the silences between steps, and the intent behind every controlled expression. In this environment, knowledge equaled leverage, and leverage was the only currency of power. That night, lying on his narrow cot, Elias considered the implications. Oakwood's fortress of control was not absolute. The master's power, though terrifying, was human, fallible, vulnerable. And the man who had been chosen to live inside the house, he, Elias, the secret witness, was beginning to understand that with patience, observation, and subtle action, even the architect of fear could be undermined. He felt the first stirring of audacity, a dangerous awareness that the unseen could become the decisive force. The first real The next morning, Elias approached the study with a deliberate calm that belied the storm of thoughts inside him. Every step on the polished floors echoed louder than usual, and he knew that silence itself had become his weapon, a way to measure the boundaries of control that Edmund Hatcher so meticulously maintained. Today, he would not just serve, he would observe, he would test. One misstep could be fatal, but one correct reading could reveal hidden truths that had been buried under decades of fear. As he dusted the desk and arranged the papers, Elias allowed his eyes to linger on the small bundle of letters again, tucked carefully in the drawer. He did not touch them, he could never risk it, but their presence was a silent reminder of the secret that had upended everything he thought he knew.
Edmund Hatcher had not merely chosen him at random. He had placed him inside the house for a reason that twisted power, guilt, and obsession into a single, unbreakable chain. And Elias, by sheer circumstance, had become the keeper of a legacy of deceit. The opportunity presented itself subtly. Edmund, seated at the far end of the room, pored over a ledger without looking up. His hand shook slightly, a tremor that betrayed fatigue or perhaps a deeper unrest. Elias noted the shift, the small quiver of human weakness beneath the mask of absolute authority. The master was vigilant, yes, but he was not infallible. Every habit, every tick, every carefully controlled expression was a vulnerability waiting to be understood. Elias began cataloging them in his mind. The way Edmund's eyes darted when a particular name was mentioned, the subtle curl of his lip when confronted with evidence of mismanagement, the faint exhale when alone that revealed the burden of secrets he carried. And then Elias dared something audacious. Instead of retreating when Edmund looked up, he held the gaze, not submissively, not in defiance, but with careful neutrality. He allowed the silence to stretch, feeling the room itself thicken with tension. Edmund studied him, and Elias could feel the calculation behind every line in the master's face, every shadow in his eyes. For the first time, the balance between them shifted, if only by the smallest fraction. The master had seen him, but he had not yet categorized him, had not yet fully reduced Elias to a tool or a ghost. Elias understood that power was never just a matter of rank or authority. It was the ability to perceive, to anticipate, to navigate the hidden currents that others ignored. By simply holding a gaze, by understanding the smallest tremor in a hand or a pause in speech, he had begun to claim a subtle form of influence, a dangerous and intoxicating form of power that no master willingly surrendered. That night, lying on his cot, Elias allowed himself a single thought. The house that had weeks passed, each day a careful choreography of observation and obedience. Elias had learned the rhythms of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the patterns in Edmund's footsteps, even the almost imperceptible scent of tension that filled the air before a confrontation. But knowledge, Elias realized, was only half the game. To survive, and to wield influence, he needed evidence, a glimpse behind the curtain of carefully orchestrated appearances. It arrived unexpectedly, in the form of a locked cabinet in Edmund's private study. Unlike the small drawer with the letters, this cabinet was heavy, adorned with brass fittings, and secured with a key that hung from a chain around Edmund's neck. Every day Elias would dust around it, careful not to disturb anything, careful to catalog the faint scratches and subtle wear that suggested a pattern of use. He noticed that Edmund always accessed it after dark, always alone, and always with a careful ritual. The lights dimmed, the door shut, the brass key turning slowly, deliberately. One night, while delivering a cup of tea, Elias noticed the key was left in the lock, a mistake, small but monumental. He could feel the pull of the unknown, the magnetic weight of forbidden knowledge. His hands trembled as he hesitated, a primal voice screaming that curiosity could kill him, yet another whisper urging him forward. With measured steps he approached the cabinet, sliding open its door. Inside lay documents, meticulously bound, detailing transactions and correspondences that hinted at a web far larger than Oakwood itself. Land deals, debts, coded communications with other plantations, each page a thread in a network of power, secrecy, and corruption. But it wasn't financial schemes that stopped his breath. It was the personal records, the names, dates, and notes about the enslaved people on the plantation, including observations of behaviors, intelligence, and loyalty. Elias realized with cold clarity that he was not just inside a house, he was inside a machine built to monitor, categorize, and manipulate every life under its roof. And then he saw it, a single entry, carefully written, almost hidden in the margins. Elias, observe, teach, do not reveal. The boy is mine. The words struck him like a lightning bolt, a confirmation that the selection had never been random. He, the son of Nora and Edmund Hatcher, had been deliberately chosen not only to serve, but to be watched, groomed, and contained. Elias closed the cabinet carefully, returning the key to its chain as if nothing had occurred. But nothing would ever be the same. The house, once merely oppressive, now revealed itself as a sentient entity, a place where
Elias moved through the house with a new awareness, each step deliberate, each glance calculated. The letters, the cabinet, the unseen networks of control, they had shifted something inside him. He was no longer merely a servant. He was a witness armed with understanding, and in that understanding lay his first power. He began observing patterns, noting where the master's attention faltered, where his household faltered, and where whispers of fear or resentment could be manipulated. Every servant, every family member was a thread, and Elias intended to learn which ones could be tugged without breaking. He started small, testing reactions. A misplaced cloth, a delayed chore, a casual glance toward the forbidden corners of the study. Each action measured, each response catalogued. He watched Edmund's eyes narrow, the subtle tightening of his jaw when something was off, the almost imperceptible pause before he resumed speaking. It was a dance of perception, a psychological game that taught Elias the limits of power and influence inside Oakwood. He realized that fear could be wielded, that silence could be a weapon, and that knowledge, hidden, precise, and unspoken, was the sharpest blade of all. Then there was Clara, always quiet, always observing. She moved like a shadow through the house, her small gestures carrying meaning that only a careful observer could catch. Elias noticed the way she lingered by certain rooms, the way her eyes softened or hardened depending on who entered. One evening, as he passed her in the dim hallway, their eyes met, and in that fleeting glance a silent pact was made. Mutual understanding without words, a recognition of the weight each carried, and the silent rebellion simmering beneath the surface. Even Thomas, whose cruelty had once been a predictable storm, became a test subject in Elias's quiet game. He observed the younger Hatcher, noting his impatience, the subtle ways he tried to assert authority, the moments when his facade cracked. Every interaction was a study in human psychology, an exercise in decoding the mechanics of fear, control, and loyalty. But Elias's most dangerous tool remained the knowledge of his lineage. The unspoken truth of being Edmund Hatcher's son gave him leverage, even if it remained unspoken. It allowed him to see the master differently, not merely as an authority, but as a man haunted, a man capable of obsession, guilt, and vulnerability. This was the insight that would allow Elias to manipulate the invisible levers of power without ever speaking the word that could destroy him. And so he began to plant subtle seeds, slight delays. It began with a sound so subtle that most would have ignored it, a soft shuffle, a whispered sigh from behind the locked study door. Elias had long learned to listen, to catch the smallest anomaly in the rhythms of Oakwood. That evening, as the candlelight flickered across the polished floorboards, he paused outside Edmund's private study, heart hammering, mind alert. The house was quiet, every footstep of the household predictable, except for the faint, irregular cadence coming from the study.
Elias pressed his ear to the door, straining. The master was not alone. There was another presence, a voice, muted, hesitant, almost reverent. A name, so faint it was nearly swallowed by the air, slipped through. Elias. It was not the casual address of a master to a servant. It was something darker, something desperate, laden with obsession and secrecy. He pulled back, a chill running through him. Edmund Hatcher, his father, was speaking of him, not in anger, not in casual reference, but in a ritualized, private obsession. Curiosity collided with fear. Elias knew the risk. Discovery could mean punishment beyond the fields, a danger far more insidious than the overseer's lash. Yet he could not resist. He returned night after night, listening, cataloging, absorbing the patterns, the cadence of Edmund's private words. The letters had revealed the truth of his birth, but these nightly whispers revealed something even more, an obsession, a fixation that bordered on madness. Edmund was not merely haunted by guilt, he was ensnared by a compulsion to control, to shape, to manipulate the very life of his illegitimate son. Then, one night, the words became clearer, the ritual unmistakable. Edmund spoke of training, of preparing him, and of a legacy that must never see the light of day. Elias's stomach turned. This was no simple paternal guilt. This was a dark, calculated program, an invisible cage forged not of wood and brick, but of psychological domination. Every interaction, every command, every lesson inside Oakwood had a purpose. He was being molded, observed, tested, and shaped in ways that would remain hidden to the casual eye. Elias began to see patterns in the house that he had never noticed, the way rooms were arranged, the placement of mirrors, the subtle adjustments in schedules, the exact timing of Edmund's appearances and disappearances. Nothing was random. Everything was controlled, orchestrated to reinforce dominance, instill obedience, and maintain secrecy. Oakwood itself was a machine, and he its unintended central gear. He realized then that he had entered a...
Elias moved through Oakwood with a new consciousness, every step a careful calculation. The house, once merely a space of strange smells and echoing corridors, now revealed itself as a deliberate maze of control. Floorboards groaned in predictable patterns. The placement of furniture, the timing of servants' movements, even the way sunlight hit the walls, it all served to reinforce Edmund Hatcher's invisible dominion. This was not happenstance. Every inch of Oakwood was a lesson in obedience, a test in endurance, a map of power designed to shape the mind as surely as it disciplined the body. He began small, testing the boundaries of the master's attention. A book slightly misplaced, a fold of cloth deliberately imperfect, a hesitation in carrying out a minor task. Each time Edmund's reaction, subtle, almost imperceptible, was recorded in Elias's mind. The master's eyes, that relentless, piercing gaze, would flicker, searching, measuring, attempting to recalibrate the world to his will. Elias realized something terrifying. The house had made him visible not only to its master, but to the invisible structures of control within every corner, every servant, every silent observer. Then he noticed the mirrors, not the large, ornamental ones that decorated the main halls, but smaller, almost hidden panes, positioned at angles that caught moments when no one thought they were being watched. Elias's reflection was never his own alone. It was always accompanied by a shadow, a presence, the intangible awareness of surveillance. He understood that the house itself was part of the experiment, a silent instrument of psychological dominance, amplifying guilt, uncertainty, and fear. Every creak, every shift of light was calibrated to unsettle him, to keep him alert, pliable, and unknowingly obedient.
But Elias's intelligence, sharpened in the fields and hardened by loss, allowed him to turn observation into strategy. He began cataloging the patterns, anticipating the master's movements, predicting the subtle manipulations designed to destabilize him. He tested Edmund's reactions, not to defy, but to map the limits of control. And in those tests, he discovered fractures, hesitation in the voice, a flicker of doubt in the gaze, a repetition of rituals that betrayed a reliance on habit over absolute mastery. With this realization came the first flicker of power. He could navigate Oakwood not merely as a subject of observation, but as a participant in a dangerous dialogue. Each step, each action, each careful silence became a chess move against the unseen architecture of dominance. Elias understood the unspoken truth. The master had chosen him not only as a witness to secrets, but as an instrument of them, and in mastering the patterns of Oakwood, he could begin to bend them, without the master ever realizing it. And yet, every revelation carried a weight heavier than the last. Knowledge here was not free